Marcus had always been good with technology. It was part of his job, and honestly, it was part of his passion. Setting up his new home's internet was supposed to be one of the easiest things on his to-do list. He had just moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood, hoping for a fresh start, away from the chaos of the city. His work as a software developer allowed him to work remotely, so having a strong, secure internet connection was non-negotiable. He set up his router, picked a strong password, and secured his network, thinking nothing of it. What he didn't know was that this simple task would soon turn into an ordeal. The first time he noticed something was off was when his internet started slowing down randomly. Marcus knew the difference between a typical service disruption and something more suspicious. He logged into his router's settings and checked the list of connected devices. He expected to see his phone, laptop, smart TV, and maybe his gaming console. But there were extra devices, ones he didn't recognize. Someone had been using his Wi-Fi. Marcus was annoyed, but not entirely surprised. Some people were shameless when it came to mooching off others' internet. He sighed, changed his password, and rebooted the router. That should have been the end of it. Then the doorbell rang. Marcus wasn't expecting anyone, and he certainly wasn't in the mood for visitors. When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with his next-door neighbor. She was a middle-aged white woman with a tight blonde bob and a permanent look of suspicion on her face. He had seen her peeking through her blinds when he moved in, but they had never spoken before. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his tone polite. The woman crossed her arms and stared him down like he was a trespasser in his own home. "Yeah, my internet just stopped working all of a sudden. I think there's some kind of interference coming from your house." Marcus blinked. "Interference?" "Yes," she said, nodding as if she had solved a mystery. "It was working fine all this time, and now suddenly it's gone. Right after you did something." Marcus frowned, quickly putting two and two together. "Wait, are you saying you were using my Wi-Fi?" The woman stiffened. "Excuse me?" "My router? Did you have access to it before?" She scoffed. "I don't know what you're talking about, but ever since you moved in, things have been weird around here." Marcus felt his patience wearing thin. "Look, lady, if you were connected to my Wi-Fi before, that means you had my old password. I changed it because I saw devices I didn't recognize. If your internet went out at the same time, then it sounds like you were using mine." Her face turned red, but she didn't back down. "I don't steal Wi-Fi," she snapped, "and I don't appreciate being accused of something like that." "Well, I don't appreciate my internet being stolen." She stared at him, her eyes narrowing. "You know what? I don't feel safe right now. A strange man moving in, messing with things. Who knows what you're up to?" Marcus exhaled sharply, trying to keep his temper in check. "I moved into my own house and changed my own Wi-Fi password. If that makes you feel unsafe, I don't know what to tell you." Instead of answering, she stormed off, muttering something under her breath. Marcus shook his head and shut the door. He figured that was the end of it. It wasn't. Less than 15 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights appeared outside his house. Marcus looked out the window, and his stomach sank. Two police officers were stepping out of their cruiser. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. A loud knock on the door followed. Marcus took a deep breath before opening it. "Good evening, sir," one of the officers said. "We got a call from a neighbor about some suspicious activity." Marcus fought the urge to roll his eyes. "Let me guess. My neighbor called because I changed my Wi-Fi password?" The officers exchanged glances. One of them looked vaguely embarrassed, but the other kept his professional stance. "We just need to ask a few questions." Marcus sighed. He had been in situations like this before. Being a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood meant he had to be extra careful. He stepped outside, making sure his hands were visible. "Mind telling us what happened?" Marcus explained everything. How he noticed unauthorized devices, changed his password, and then had his neighbor banging on his door, accusing him of interfering with her connection. The officer who looked embarrassed sighed and nodded. "All right, sir, that sounds reasonable." But the other officer looked toward Karen, who was standing on her lawn with her arms crossed. "Ma'am, you said you felt unsafe. Did he threaten you in any way?" Karen gasped, as if just being asked the question reminded her of her fear. "He was very aggressive," she claimed. I didn't know what he was doing, and when I asked, he got defensive. I panicked. I don't know what people like him are capable of. Marcus clenched his jaw. People like me? The first officer sighed. Sir, we're not trying to escalate anything here. We just want to make sure everything's all right. Everything would have been all right if my neighbor hadn't been stealing my Wi-Fi, Marcus said, crossing his arms. The officers exchanged another glance. Finally, the more reasonable one turned to Karen. Ma'am, unless you have any actual evidence of wrongdoing, there's no crime here. Changing a Wi-Fi password isn't illegal. Karen's face twisted in frustration. But, do you have proof he did anything criminal? The officer asked. Karen hesitated. No, but. Then there's nothing we can do, he said firmly. Have a good night. Karen huffed, muttering under her breath, and stomped back into her house. Marcus let out a long breath as the officers left. Shaking his head, he walked back inside. He had only been here for a short time, and he already knew this was going to be a long, long stay. Marcus had always been careful about his online security. It wasn't just a habit, it was second nature to him. He worked in cybersecurity, after all. That was why the whole Wi-Fi debacle with his neighbor, Karen, had left him feeling uneasy. It wasn't just that she had been using his internet, it was the way she reacted when she got caught, the way she had twisted the situation and making herself the victim and painting him as some kind of threat. It was something he couldn't ignore. A few days had passed since the police showed up at his door, and Marcus was doing his best to move on. He had changed his Wi-Fi password, strengthened his security settings, and set up alerts for any unusual activity. He figured that would be the end of it. But something kept nagging at him. One evening, as he was unwinding after work, he decided to check his router logs again. He didn't expect to find anything, but he was curious. He logged in and navigated to the list of connected devices. As expected, only his devices showed up. But when he checked the history, he noticed something strange. His Wi-Fi had been accessed multiple times over the past few weeks by several unknown devices. That wasn't the surprising part. He had already realized Karen had been mooching off his internet. But what caught his attention was the pattern. The devices had been connecting at odd hours, late at night, early in the morning, times when most people weren't actively online. And the data usage? It was high, way too high for someone who was just browsing the internet or streaming Netflix. A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't just casual Wi-Fi theft. Karen, or someone in her house, had been using his connection for something serious. Marcus clicked through the logs, scanning the sites that had been accessed. While he couldn't see exact pages, he could see domains and categories. At first, it was nothing too suspicious. Streaming sites, social media, a couple of news pages. But then he saw something that made his stomach tighten. There were connections to encrypted messaging platforms, ones often used for illicit activities. There were visits to black market websites, the kind that sold stolen credit card information, fake IDs, and even more disturbing content. Some of the flagged websites had been reported for illegal transactions, and others were known for hosting stolen data. Marcus exhaled sharply, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. This wasn't just an annoying neighbor stealing internet to scroll through Facebook. Someone in Karen's house had been accessing shady, possibly criminal content using his network. He immediately took screenshots, documenting every suspicious connection. He saved the logs, backing them up to an encrypted folder. He knew better than to jump to conclusions, but he also knew one thing for sure. He didn't want to get caught up in whatever Karen was involved in. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. He could report it, but he didn't want to go to the police just yet. The last thing he needed was to be dragged into something that had nothing to do with him. He needed more information. A thought crossed his mind, and he smirked. If Karen had been using his Wi-Fi for that long, she was probably still trying to figure out why she couldn't connect. And if she was desperate to get back online, maybe he could have a little fun with it. He opened his router settings and changed his Wi-Fi network name to something new, something she would definitely notice. Nice try, Karen. He sat back, waiting to see what would happen. It didn't take long. Within an hour, there was loud, angry knocking at his door. Marcus took a deep breath before opening it. Karen stood there, her face red with frustration, her arms crossed tightly. She pointed toward his house. What the hell is that supposed to mean? She demanded. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What are you talking about? Your Wi-Fi name, she snapped. Are you trying to harass me? Marcus folded his arms, suppressing a smirk. That's funny. Why would my Wi-Fi name bother you? Unless you were trying to connect to it. For a split second, panic flashed across Karen's face before she masked it with anger. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is harassment. I could call the police again. Marcus stared at her for a moment before speaking. You could, he said calmly, but then I might have to show them some interesting things I found in my Wi-Fi logs. Karen's mouth snapped shut. Her face paled, and she took a step back. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice suddenly quieter. Marcus shrugged. I'm just saying, someone in your house has been visiting some pretty interesting websites. You sure you want to get the cops involved again? Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't respond. Marcus let the silence stretch between them, letting her stew in her own thoughts. He could see the wheels turning in her head, the realization sinking in that she had just backed herself into a corner. Finally, she turned on her heel and stormed off without another word. Marcus shut the door and let out a small chuckle. He had a feeling this wasn't over. But at least now, Karen knew he wasn't someone to mess with. Marcus had expected Karen to back off after their last encounter, but he knew better than to assume it was over. People like her never let things go, especially when they felt embarrassed or exposed. Still, he was prepared. He had his logs saved, his security tightened, and his patience running low. The next few days were quiet, almost too quiet. He didn't see Karen lingering outside, didn't catch her watching him through her blinds, and most importantly, there were no more surprise visits from the police. It should have been a relief, but something about it felt off. He knew she wasn't the type to just drop something, especially after the way their last conversation had ended. Then, strange things started happening. One morning, as Marcus sat down to start work, he noticed his internet was slower than usual. At first, he thought it was just a temporary issue, but when he checked his router, he saw something alarming. Someone was trying to access his network again. His security settings had blocked the attempts, but whoever it was had been persistent, trying multiple times throughout the night. Karen. It had to be her. Either she was still desperate to get online, or she was trying to get back at him. Either way, Marcus wasn't about to let it slide. He spent the next hour reinforcing his security even further, setting up additional encryption and alerts that would immediately notify him if someone so much as looked at his network the wrong way. But that wasn't the end of it. Later that evening, he went outside to take out the trash and noticed something strange. His car tires looked lower than usual. He crouched down, pressing a finger against them. Soft, almost deflated. His stomach tightened as he checked the others. 2 of them were in the same condition. Marcus let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had let air out of his tires. Not slashed them, not enough to completely disable his car, but just enough to be an inconvenience. He knew exactly who it was. Instead of reacting right away, he pulled out his phone and checked his security cameras. He had installed them as soon as he moved in. Another habit from working in cybersecurity. He scrolled through the footage, fast-forwarding through hours of nothing until he found what he was looking for. There she was, Karen, sneaking up to his driveway in the middle of the night, crouching by his tires. She was wearing dark clothes, but it was unmistakably her. She glanced around before pressing something against the tire valve. A slow, deliberate act of petty revenge. Marcus clenched his jaw. This woman had already stolen his Wi-Fi, lied to the police, and now she was messing with his property? That was the last straw. He spent the next few hours carefully plotting his response. He wasn't the type to let things slide, but he also wasn't going to retaliate in a way that would get him into trouble. Instead, he was going to be smart about it. The next morning, he put his plan into action. He printed out several still images from his security footage showing Karen messing with his tires. Then he wrote a simple note. Karen, I have security cameras. I know what you did. Try it again and I'll file a police report. Your move. He placed the note and the images in an envelope, walked over to her house and slipped it into her mailbox. Then he waited. Hours passed with no response. Then around noon, he saw her step outside, checking her mail. She pulled out the envelope and opened it right there on her porch. The moment her eyes landed on the pictures, her entire body stiffened. Marcus watched from his window as her head snapped up, scanning the street, her face twisted with panic. She turned, looking directly at his house, but he didn't move. He just let her sit with it. Seconds later, she stormed back inside, slamming her door shut. Marcus smirked. That night, he checked his security cameras again, just to be sure. No suspicious activity, no attempted break-ins, no more tire nonsense. For the first time since moving in, he felt like he had finally won. But something in his gut told him this wasn't over yet. Marcus had expected some kind of reaction from Karen after she found the envelope, but what followed was complete silence. No yelling, no confrontations, no passive-aggressive antics. Just nothing. At first, it felt like a win. He had called her out, put her in check, and sent a clear message. He wasn't someone she could mess with. But as the days passed without incident, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was too easy. Karen wasn't the type to just back down, not after how she had acted before. Something was coming. He just didn't know what. Then, one evening, it happened. Marcus had just wrapped up work and was settling in to watch a movie when he heard a loud knock at his door. Not the usual impatient banging Karen was known for. This was deliberate, heavy. A bad feeling crept over him as he set his drink down and got up. When he opened the door, he wasn't surprised to see a police officer standing there. "Mr. Carter?" the officer asked. Marcus kept his expression neutral. "That's me. What's going on?" "We received a report from your neighbor, Karen Whitman. She claims you've been harassing her and making threats." Marcus exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. "Here we go." "Officer, with all due respect, that's not what's happening here," he said calmly. "Karen has been the one causing problems. She was stealing my internet. She let the air out of my tires, and I have security footage proving it." The officer nodded. "She mentioned something about a note." Marcus wasn't fazed. "Yes, I left her a note after catching her on camera messing with my car. I didn't threaten her. I just told her that if she did it again, I'd file a police report, which, honestly, I should have done the first time." The officer gave him a measured look. "Do you have that footage?" "Absolutely." Marcus stepped back and gestured for the officer to come in. He wasn't hiding anything. It only took a few minutes to pull up the recordings. Marcus played the video showing Karen sneaking into his driveway, crouching by his tires, and pressing something against the valve. The officer leaned in, watching closely. When the footage ended, the officer sighed. "That's pretty clear evidence." "Glad you think so," Marcus said, "because this is getting ridiculous. First, she steals my Wi-Fi, then she calls the cops on me for changing my own password, and now this." The officer straightened. "I'll have a talk with her. If she keeps this up, you may want to consider filing a formal complaint, but for now, I'd recommend avoiding any further contact with her." Marcus nodded. "Trust me, I don't want anything to do with her." The officer gave him a small nod before heading back across the street. Marcus stood in his doorway watching as he knocked on Karen's door. She opened it almost immediately, and though Marcus couldn't hear their conversation, he could see her face turn pale as the officer spoke to her. She glanced in his direction for a split second before quickly looking away. A few minutes later, the officer left, and Karen slammed her door shut. Marcus closed his own door and exhaled. Maybe, finally, this would be the end of it. For the rest of the evening, he kept an eye on his security cameras, but there was no movement from Karen's house. No more attempted break-ins to his Wi-Fi, no slashed tires, no sudden police visits, just quiet. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt like he could finally relax. But that feeling didn't last long. Around midnight, he was lying in bed, half asleep, when his phone buzzed with an alert from his security system. A motion detection warning. His stomach dropped as he grabbed his phone and checked the live feed. At first, he didn't see anything unusual. His front yard was empty, his car was untouched, and there was no sign of movement. But then, he noticed something. His mailbox was open. That was odd. He was sure it had been closed earlier. Frowning, he got out of bed, threw on a hoodie, and stepped outside to check. The air was cool, the neighborhood quiet, everything looked normal, except for the envelope now sitting inside his mailbox. His pulse quickened as he pulled it out. There was no return address, no markings, just a plain white envelope. He stepped back inside, locking the door behind him before carefully opening it. Inside was a single piece of paper. "This isn't over." Marcus stared at the words, his grip tightening. He had been right all along. Karen wasn't done with him yet. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at the note in his hands. "This isn't over." The words were simple, but the message was clear. Karen wasn't backing down. If anything, this was her way of letting him know she wasn't done making his life miserable. A part of him had hoped that after the police had spoken to her, she would finally leave him alone. But clearly that had only made things worse. She wasn't just a nosy, entitled neighbor anymore. She was someone with a grudge, and that made her dangerous. He took a deep breath and forced himself to think. She hadn't done anything illegal this time, at least not directly. Leaving a note wasn't a crime, but it was a warning, and Marcus wasn't about to sit around and wait for her next move. Instead of reacting right away, he decided to get ahead of her. He grabbed his phone and started documenting everything. The Wi-Fi theft, the fake 911 call, the police visit, the tire incident, the footage, and now the note. He compiled it all into a detailed file, making sure there was no room for doubt. If she tried anything else, he would have everything he needed to take action. But Karen wasn't his only problem. Later that morning, as he was getting ready for work, he noticed something strange. His emails weren't loading. His phone showed a weak connection, even though his internet should have been fine. He checked his router and saw something that made his stomach drop. Someone had tried to hack into his network. Again, the logs showed multiple failed login attempts. Whoever it was had been trying different passwords, hoping to force their way in. And judging by the timestamps, the attempts had started right around the time he had received the note. Marcus clenched his jaw. Karen was persistent, but she was sloppy. She had already made the mistake of underestimating him once. Now she was doing it again. He activated a new layer of security on his router, this time a honeypot trap. If she or anyone else tried to break in again, they wouldn't just fail. They would unknowingly trigger a trace. He would be able to pinpoint exactly where the attacks were coming from. Then he waited. It didn't take long. That night, another attempt came through, and this time Marcus was ready. His system instantly flagged the source. He pulled up the data and smirked when he saw the result, Karen's IP address. That was all he needed. The next morning, instead of going to work, Marcus made a stop at the local police station. He walked in, file in hand, and calmly approached the front desk. "I'd like to report cyber harassment, attempted hacking, and vandalism," he said. The officer at the desk raised an eyebrow. "You have evidence?" Marcus set the file down. "Plenty." He walked them through everything. Karen stealing his Wi-Fi, falsely calling 911 on him, deflating his tires, leaving him a threatening note, and now actively trying to hack into his network. The officer's expression shifted from mild curiosity to full attention as Marcus pulled up the logs and security footage. "This is serious," the officer said, flipping through the evidence. "If what you're saying checks out, she could be looking at multiple charges." "I just want her to leave me alone," Marcus said. "I've tried to ignore her, I've tried to handle it myself, but she keeps escalating." The officer nodded. "We'll take it from here." That same evening, Marcus watched from his window as a police car pulled up in front of Karen's house. He saw her answer the door, her expression quickly shifting from irritation to panic as the officers started questioning her. She tried to argue, tried to play the victim like she always did, but this time it wasn't working. Minutes later, they led her out in handcuffs. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, he finally felt like he could breathe. Karen was done. It was over. The next few days were peaceful. No more strange knocks at his door, no more police visits, no more paranoia every time he checked his Wi-Fi. He could finally go back to living his life without having to look over his shoulder. One evening, as he sat on his porch sipping a well-earned beer, his phone buzzed, a notification from his security system. But this time, it wasn't an alert. Just a simple message, "No threats detected." Marcus smiled. For the first time in a long time, everything was exactly as it should be.